God, don't we? Serve an amazing God. Have a copy of God's Word. Go into the book of Numbers, chapter 11. Numbers chapter 11, we'll read verses 1 through 10 and want to talk tonight on this question, are you satisfied? Are you satisfied? Numbers chapter 11. We'll begin reading at verse 1 through verse 10. It'll be on the screen. Reading from the English Standard Version. It says, "And the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, His anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So the name of that place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. And the people of Israel also wept again and said, Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at. Now the manna was like coriander seed, and its appearance like that of bdellium. The people went about and gathered it, and ground it in hand mills, or beat it in mortars, and boiled it in pots, and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. When the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell with it." Verse 10, "Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, every one at the door of his tent. And the anger of the Lord blazed hotly, and Moses was displeased." Are you satisfied? In 1965, the Rolling Stones released a song entitled, "I Can't Get No Satisfaction." That song summarizes a lot of people's lives. If you were to ask people if they were satisfied with their lives and content with how things are in their life, a good majority of people would tell you that they're not satisfied. If you were to ask most people what they want, most people would say, "I want just a little bit more." That's the reality of people. We just want more. And here's the thing. They think that if they get more, then they'll be satisfied and happy. You've got people that think, if I just had more money, then I'd be happy and I'd be content. Or if I just had another car, if I just had another vehicle, then I'd be satisfied, I'd be happy, and my life would be fulfilled and it would be complete. But here's the problem with getting more. You still want more. More never satisfies. More never brings fulfillment to our life. In fact, most of us who have worked secular jobs, the reality is when we got a pay raise, we only wanted more money the next time around. We're never satisfied or content with what we have. We simply want more. In fact, Ecclesiastes 5 and 10, Solomon, the wisest man outside of Jesus, said this. He says, "He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity." Here in Numbers chapter 11, we see the people of Israel. They're still complaining against God because they're not satisfied with what God has done for them. In fact, go back into the book of Exodus and you see that when God brought them out of Egypt, that it wasn't but a few days later, they began to complain to God and complain to Moses because they didn't have the things that they thought they should need. And they even said these words, "We'd been better off to stay in Egypt than to come out here into this wilderness and die." For a little over a year, God has blessed the people of God. He has blessed His children. He's provided for their every need. But they're still complaining and they're still unthankful for what God has done for them. They weren't satisfied with God and His blessings. Let me ask you tonight, are you satisfied with what God has done for you? Are you content with God's blessings? Are you content with what God has poured out into your life? Or do you wish that He would do more? I want us to look at this text tonight, and there's several lessons that we can learn that will help us to be more satisfied and to learn how to be content with God's blessings. Number one, avoid the sin of complaining. You want to learn how to be satisfied and learn how to be content? Avoid the sin of complaining. Let's look at verses 1 through 3 again. It says, and the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So the name of that place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. You'll see right there in verse 1, the people complained. They were complaining about the hardships of life in the wilderness. Now I know that it was not easy living in the wilderness. I know that it couldn't have been easily traveling through the wilderness and having to deal with the heat of the day and the cool of the night. But the reality is, this isn't the first time that they've complained. In Exodus chapter 3, just 15, just 3 days after being delivered from Egypt, they complained because they didn't have water. Now think about that. God had sent 10 plagues into the land of Egypt and delivered them out from the hand of Pharaoh, and they get 3 days in the journey and they're already complaining that they don't have water. In Exodus 16, verses 2 and 3, they complained about a lack of food. Again, in Exodus 17, verse 2 and 3, they complained about a lack of water. The children of Israel were nothing but a bunch of spoiled little children. They thought that God was supposed to keep handing out and keep handing out and keep doing, and God had already done so much for them, but they were acting like a bunch of spoiled children, that God's supposed to just give them everything that they want. But listen, it's no different today. We still complain and we still gripe today. If we'd be honest, there are times when we're not happy with how God's blessing and with how God's not moving in our life. If we'd be honest, there are times that we find fault with everything and nothing can please us, and we're not content with what God has done for us. Let's just be honest. There are times we look at other people and we see what God has done for them, and we come just a little bit jealous and envious. And we begin to complain to God, God, why aren't you doing that for me? God, why aren't you moving in my life like that? God, why aren't you giving me more? And why can't I have what they have? You see, if we were honest, we'd all have to say that we're just like the children of Israel at times. We tend to forget about what God has already done for us, and we start complaining because He may not be moving right now on our behalf. Because we think we deserve more and God's not giving more. Sometimes we find ourselves just like the children of Israel, not satisfied with what God has done, and we begin to gripe and complain and moan, and we become bitter and angry towards God because God's not doing more for us. When things go wrong, we gripe, we grumble, and we moan and get upset just like the children of Israel. And this text tells us that we need to avoid complaining. Why? Well, first of all, it's sinful. It's sinful. When we begin to gripe and complain against God and what God has done or what God hasn't done, it is sinful. If you have a King James or New King James, it says that it displeased the Lord. It's sinful. It doesn't please God. But listen, it also tells us that when we complain, it stirs God's anger up. It gets God mad. It gets God angry when we become ungrateful and begin to complain. We see here in the text that complaining brought God's judgment on the people. It says that God sent fire and destroyed those who complained. What if God still dealt with us the same way that He dealt with the people of Israel? Well, some of us wouldn't be here, would we? Complaining has consequences. I just believe this, that when we begin to complain, you're actually going to get God to withhold His blessing from you until you can learn how to be more thankful. Because here's the thing, me being a father, I love my children, but if my children can't appreciate what I give to them and all they do is complain about it, then I want to close my hand and not give anything else. And I believe God does the same things, that when we complain and when we become bitter, that God will withhold blessing and God will withhold favor until we learn to be grateful. Complaining can lead to God's judgment. He punished these people for their complaining. He sent fire and He destroyed them. But notice what else the text says. It says the Lord heard everything they said. You see, often when we do our complaining, we do it to somebody else, usually in private, or we usually have our own pity party. But here's the thing, God hears it all. When you're muttering under your breath and nobody else knows and nobody else hears and you're getting all upset and uptight because of what God hasn't done yet, God hears. He hears our complaining. He hears our griping. You see, instead of complaining, there's two things that we should do. We should be thankful. Amen? And instead of griping about things not going our way, we should learn how to be thankful. If you look at the people of Israel and you look at what God had done for them so far, they had plenty to thank God for. God had delivered them from bondage. He delivered them from Pharaoh. He performed miracles before their very eyes. God had been good to them, and yet they're still complaining. And here's the thing, God has been good to us. He's delivered us from sin. He's delivered us from bondage. He's brought us out of a spiritual Egypt, and He's brought us into His kingdom and into His church, and so many times we still complain. God has worked miracles in our lives. God has sent provision for us. God has healed our sicknesses. God has answered our prayers. And yet, so many times we complain instead of be grateful. We ought to thank Him, church, for what He has done instead of complain to Him. But not only should we be thankful, we need to look to the Lord in prayer. You see, when faced with problems and when faced with hardship, we should pray, not complain. Philippians 4:6 tells us this. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. The New Living Translation says, don't worry about anything, instead pray about everything. That's what it means. Don't worry about anything, but pray about everything. If you'll notice in the text, Numbers chapter 11, that after the fire of God's judgment broke out, the people asked Moses to intercede. And in the last part of verse 2, it says, when Moses prayed to the Lord, the fire was quenched. The fire was extinguished. The fire died down. You see, God answered prayer. And if we'll trust Him and call out to Him, God will answer our prayer. Instead of complaining, we need to be thankful, and we need to take our problem and our need to the Lord in prayer. This text tells us we should avoid the sin of complaining. But the second thing we learn from this text is this. We should focus on what you have, not what you don't have. Focus on what you have, not what you don't have. Look at verses 4 through 9. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. And the people of Israel also wept again and said, oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up. And notice this, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at. Now the manna was like coriander seed, and its appearance like that of bdellium. The people went about and gathered it and ground it in hand mills or beat it in mortars and boiled it in pots and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. When the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell with it. In verse 4, we see the people go from complaining to lusting. If you've got a King James, it says they fell a-lusting. The New King James says they yielded to intense craving. The New American Standard says that they had greedy desires. In the text that I'm reading from, it says they had a strong craving. If you were to look up that word lusting in the King James, it means simply this. They lusted a lust, or they desired a desire. In other words, this was a strong desire. This was an intense craving. Moses is saying that the people lusted intensely after the things of Egypt. We also see in verse 4 here in this translation, it talks about the rabble. If you have King James, it talks about the mixed multitude. And this refers to foreigners. Most likely it's speaking of Egyptians that fled with the people of Israel. In other words, when the children of Israel began to leave that night, when God delivered them, there were Egyptians that said, hey, if God's doing all this, we may as well just go ahead and leave with the children of Israel. And so they fled with them. And now you have this intermingling of races. And as a result of this intermingling, and as a result of this mixing between Israelites and Egyptians, you've got the people of Israel now joining in with the foreigners, and they're complaining about what they're missing out on. Hear me. If we start mingling and mixing with the ungodliness of this world, it is sure to lead to lusting after the things of the world. Let me say that again. If we begin to mix and mingle with the ungodliness of this world, it is going to lead us to lusting after the things of the world. I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to win lost people. I'm not saying that we need to just hide out in the four walls of the church and isolate ourselves from everybody around us. But we need to be very careful that we don't get caught up and intertwined and begin to mix and mingle with ungodly things of this world, because then we'll begin to lust after it. And we'll want the things of this world rather than the things of God. You know, 1 John warns us, do not love the world, neither the things of the world. The things that are in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life, it's not of God. And it's not going to last. Numbers chapter 11, verse 5 and 6. Here's what the people begin to say. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at. They were so focused on what they didn't have that they had forgotten how God had blessed them every day with manna from heaven. Think about that. Several million people, and God has provided day after day after day. But now they're in a situation where they're wanting meat, they're tired of manna, they're tired of what God has given. And all they can do is look back to what they used to have. And they're despising what God had given them. They weren't satisfied with what they had because they were too busy lusting for what they didn't have. They thought they had it better while they were back in Egypt. They said that they ate all they wanted while in Egypt. But here's the thing. They seemed to have forgotten that while they were in Egypt, they were slaves. That they talk about sitting around the pots and eating the leeks and the onions and the garlics, but they forget, Brother Lynn, that they were in slavery. And yet they thought, they're thinking, we had it so much better when we were in Egypt. Here's the thing, when you begin to lust after the things of the world, you often forget just how good you have it now. They were too caught up in what they didn't have that they weren't grateful for what they did have. Hear me, whenever we focus on what we don't have, we tend to become ungrateful for what we do have, and we also become discontent with what we have. But isn't that the story of our lives? We often want what we don't have. That when we see somebody else who has it, we want it also. And we begin to focus on all those things instead of really looking at what God has given to us. Listen, God had given them everything that they needed to live, and they despised God and they despised the gift that God had given them. They weren't satisfied or content with what God had provided. Manna, it was everything they needed. Certainly it wasn't a filet mignon, but it was everything they needed. It wasn't lobster, and it wasn't steak, and it wasn't shrimp, but it provided all the nourishment that they needed to survive in the wilderness, and God gave it to them day after day after day. He was faithful to provide, and they say, hey, that we had some meat. Oh, that we could just go back to Egypt and sit around the pots, but all we have is this manna. The Bible tells us that the manna was tasty. There in verse 8 it says the people went about and gathered it and ground it in hand mills or beat it in mortars and boiled it in pots and made cakes of it. Notice this. And the taste of it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. Sounds to me like a good biscuit. But they'd gotten tired of it. God had taken care of them for over a year now, but they wanted more. They wanted full bellies. They wanted a variety of food more than they wanted God. Sounds like us. We have a tendency, as I've already said, to see what others have, and we want it too. Somebody else gets a new home, and we want a new home. Somebody gets a new car, and we want a new car. They get a new outfit, and we want a new outfit. Instead of being thankful for what we have, we often long for what we don't have. And so here's the thing. We often buy stuff with money we don't have, and we don't need to start with to try to impress people who don't really care. Let me say it again. We buy stuff with money we don't have and with stuff that we don't really need just to simply try to impress people who don't really care. You've heard the phrase, I'm sure, about keeping up with the Joneses. I don't know who the Joneses are anyway, but so many times we try to keep up with them. And here's the thing, the Joneses don't know who you are. And they could care less. But yet so many times we have this idea that I've just got to have more. Because we've stopped looking at what God has given us already, and we think that somehow God's withholding from us. And God's not taking care of us. But the reality is God has been good to us. God has blessed us abundantly. Listen, I may not have all that I want, but I can guarantee I have all that I need. I have clothes on my back. I have a roof over my head. I've got food to eat day after. Listen, I eat. I need to lose some of this because I eat too much. We're blessed abundantly, but so often we're looking at what we don't have instead of really focusing on what we do. If you're going to learn how to be more content with God and satisfied, you've got to focus on what you have instead of what you don't have. Let me ask you, are you satisfied with what you have, or do you long for more? Are you more focused on what you don't have, or are you focused on what you do have? Are you content with what God has provided you, or are you like the Israelites, simply wanting more? Are you satisfied? But there's a third thing I want us to notice from this text. Not only do we need to avoid the sin of complaining, and not only do we need to focus on what we have instead of what we don't have, but we need to be careful what you ask for. Be careful what you ask for. Let's look at verse 18 through 21. Say to the people, consecrate yourselves, or sanctify yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat. If you have wept in the hearing of the Lord, saying, who will give us meat to eat? For it was better for us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. Now notice this. You shall not eat just 1 day, or 2 days, or 5 days, or 10 days, or 20 days, but a whole month, until it comes out at your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have rejected the... Notice that. They've rejected the Lord who is among you, and have wept before Him, saying, why did we come out of Egypt? But Moses said, the people among with whom I am number 600,000 on foot, and you have said, I will give them meat that they may eat a whole month. And then verse 31 through 35, let's go ahead and read that. It says, then a wind from the Lord sprang up, and it brought quail from the sea, and let them fall beside the camp, about a day's journey on this side, and a day's journey on the other side, around the camp, and about 2 cubits above the ground. And the people rose all that day, notice this, all that night, and all the next day, and gathered the quail. Those who gathered least gathered 10 homers. And they spread them out. In other words, they kind of laid them out to dry the meat out like you'd kind of do jerky. They spread them out for themselves all around the camp. While the meat was yet between their teeth, before it was consumed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord struck down the people with a very great plague. Therefore, the name of that place was called Kibroth Hattaavah. Now, that name right there, it means graves of gluttony, graves of craving, or graves of lusting. That's what it stands for. Their lusting and their gluttonous attitude sent them to their grave. Their desire for more, instead of having a desire for God, sent them to their grave. It says, because there they buried the people who had the craving. From Kibroth Hattaavah the people journeyed to Hazeroth, and they remained at Hazeroth. God says in these verses, if you want meat, I'll give you meat. In fact, God says to them, I'm going to give you so much meat that you're going to get sick of it. That's what He says in verse 19 and 20. In verse 20, in the translation that I read, it says that He was going to give it to them to such a degree that it becomes loathsome to you. That word loathsome, it means disgusted or repulsed. You're going to have it until you're fed up with it. You're going to have meat until you can't stand it any longer. You're going to become disgusted and repulsed with it. That's how much I'm going to give you. Have you ever had something, a certain food that you ate so much that you just grew tired of it and didn't want it anymore? That you eat chicken for so long and so many days until you just don't want to see chicken anymore? Have you been there? Well, that's what Moses is saying here in verse 20, that I'm going to give you so much meat until you're just tired of it. God sent so much quail that if you read this, the entire area was covered. All around the camp, quail filled the land. It says there that it was going to be 2 cubits above the ground there in verse 31. And either this means the quail were flying about 3 feet above the ground, or it could also possibly mean that the quail were going to be 3 feet deep on the land. That's how much God was going to... Now think about that. That every which way you look, there's quail, and they could be stacked up 3 feet high all around. God gave them what they wanted. He responded to them, but the text says He got angry with them. And as a result, He sent judgment on the people who were craving. Those who were lusting and those who were gluttonous. He sent judgment upon them. It says that He struck them with a plague and they died. Now, here's the question that came to my mind as I studied this text. Why did God give them what they wanted? And as I sat and thought about it, here's what I came up with. I believe God gave them what they wanted to simply show them that they didn't need anything else but Him. They complained and griped because they weren't content with what they had. In other words, they weren't content with God. So I believe God allowed them to have what they thought they needed to show them that He was really what they needed. And they should be satisfied with Him. At times, God may give you what you ask for, even though it may not be best for you, just to show you you should be content and satisfied with Him. How many times have we gotten things that we didn't really need, and it only caused aggravation and trouble? But we prayed about it, we fasted over it, and we thought we had to have it, and God said, if you want it, I'll give it to you. Only for it to ruin us. Have you been there? You see, you got to be careful what you ask for because you just might get it. Amen? Be careful what you ask for because God might give it to you. And when you get it, you may find out that you don't like what you got as much as you thought you would. They thought they wanted meat, and God gave them meat, but here's the thing, they got sick of it. The New Living Translation tells us that they were gorging themselves on it, and while the meat was still in their mouth, God got angry and He gave them a plague, and they died. I've come to understand that in my walk with God and in my years of serving Him that many times I want what I don't need, but here's the thing, what I need, I don't want. Isn't that true of us? We often want what we don't need, but the things we need, we don't want. Here's a great lesson for us to learn and to take away from all of this that we've read tonight. God knows what we need, and we should learn to be content with what He has given us. Listen, if you don't have it, it's probably because God knows you don't need it. I'd like $1 million, but listen, if I don't have it, it's because God knows I don't need it. I believe that, yes, there are people that God blesses and God entrusts with wealth and God entrusts them with riches because He knows their motive and He knows their heart and He knows they'll put it to good work. But there are some people that God can't trust them with stuff like that. In fact, the Bible tells us that if you can't be trusted with little, how can you be entrusted with the true riches of the kingdom? But there are times when God will give us what we think we need just to show us you don't really need that. We've got to learn how to be content, church. That's the main lesson from Numbers chapter 11 is we've got to learn how to be satisfied and content with what God has given us. And if we can learn how to be content with what God has given us and learn how to be satisfied with it and learn how to be good stewards, good managers of it, God may see fit to give you even more, but we've got to learn how to be content with what He blesses us with. Something we've got to understand that we often forget is this: it all belongs to God. We're simply managers of it. We're simply supposed to oversee it and be a steward of it. Paul talks about contentment in Philippians chapter 4, verse 10 through 13. Remember, in Philippians, he's writing from a prison cell. He says, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You are indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Notice this. Not that I'm speaking of being in need. He said, I have learned. You've got to learn how to be content. I've learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned, notice this, the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. And notice verse 13, I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. Many times we take that verse completely out of context. And we want to say it there, hey, with God, I can do all things. That I can go and conquer the world. I can go and do this and do this. And that's not what it means. Paul is saying that, hey, it doesn't matter if I have a lot or if I have a little. With God's strength, I can face every situation in life. If I have abundance or if I have lack because of His strength, I can handle it. I can deal with it. This isn't a verse that we can go out and just conquer the world. But we can handle whatever comes into our life. That's what it means. That when we're weak, He's strong. And when we don't have enough and there is lack, His grace is sufficient and His strength gets us through. Hebrews 13:5. Keep your life free from love of money and be content with what you have. People often say money is the root of all evil. That's not what the Bible says. The Bible says the love of money is the root of all evil. The writer of Hebrews says, keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. 1 Timothy 6:6. Godliness with contentment is great gain. You want to know what true wealth is and true spiritual riches is? Live a godly life and learn how to be content. If you could talk to Paul, Paul would tell you he was the wealthiest man in all of the world. And it's not because of his checking account, but it's because of his relationship with Christ. In fact, you study Philippians, I think in chapter 2 or verse 3, he says, whatever things were gained to me, I counted it all a loss, that I may know Christ. He wanted to know the surpassing riches of Christ. As I close tonight, I want to ask you again, are you satisfied with your life? Are you content with what God has blessed you with? I'll be honest, there are times in my life that I've been envious of others and jealous of others. But we've got to learn how to be content. If you're here tonight and you say, Pastor, I'm satisfied, I'm content with what God has done for me, you need to stop complaining and be thankful. If you say, Pastor, I'm happy with the way things are in my life, and you need to learn to stop complaining and just learn how to be grateful. If you're here tonight and you're not satisfied, if you're here tonight and you look at your life and you take a survey of everything and you think that somehow God's holding out on you and you have a tendency to complain and a tendency to get upset, you've got to start focusing on what you do have rather than what you don't have. Listen, if you'll begin to count your blessings and name them one by one, you'll find out just how much you really do have. Take a survey of your life. And you'll see how blessed you really are. In fact, take a look at somebody in a third world country and you'll see just how good you have it. If you've got running water, you're blessed. There are places around this world that they have to go down into filthy water to get drinking water, and it's water that animals have come through. And you know what animals do? I don't have to say anything else. You know what animals do? That's the only water they have. If you got a car and a way to go, you're really blessed. Well, preacher, I'm not a millionaire. Well, you're blessed. If you've got a home, you're blessed. If you've got electricity, you're blessed. You got clothes on your back. You got food to eat day after day after day. You're blessed. And yet so often, we still end up complaining. We still end up being upset with God. If we'd be honest tonight, most of us have more than enough. And you want me to just let you know why you have more than enough? It's so that those who don't have enough can have enough. Let me just say this. God's blessings upon our life is not so that we can go out and get more stuff. It's so that we can pour into somebody else. And here's the thing. If God can get it to you, He needs to be able to get it through you so that somebody else can be blessed. But let's be honest tonight. Most of the time, I know what it's like. You get raises at work and your lifestyle goes up a little bit. I can drive something a little bit better now and make more money. I can dress a little nicer. I've done it. Instead of taking that extra and investing into God's kingdom and investing into somebody who don't have, put it to my use. Preacher, you say there's anything wrong with having nice stuff? No, but I'll say this, you can't take none of it with you when you go. And we will give an account for how we've used what God's given us. This isn't a financial message, this isn't a money message tonight. It's simply saying that we've got to learn how to be content and we've got to learn how to be generous and be a blessing to others because God has blessed us. Lastly, as I've already said, the final point, you just be careful what you ask for. You might get it and then you're going to be miserable if you do. You see, there's so many people that think, I want to drive a new car, but here's the thing, the first time that first payment comes around and it loses that new car smell, it's not so nice, is it? Amen? Not so wonderful, is it? God is all that we need. He was all that the people of Israel needed, and He's all that you and I need. He alone satisfies, and He gives fulfillment to life. And if we will trust Him, He will take care of us. It might be that He just gives us manna day after day after day, but listen, He's never promised to give us all we want. Let me say that again. God's never promised to give us all we want. He's promised to give us everything we need. That's why Jesus said in the Lord's Prayer, give us today our daily bread. God hadn't promised to give you enough to store up for tomorrow. He said just when you pray, give us this day our daily bread. That's all He's promised to give, daily bread. And if He gives you extra, give to somebody who don't have. This is sort of a cliche, but it's so true. If God is all that you have all that you need. Amen? If He's all that we have everything that we need. So I ask you as I close tonight, are you satisfied? Are you content? It's not always easy. We have to learn how to be content. And we have to learn how to be satisfied. I mean, if we would be honest at times, we struggle with greed and we struggle with materialism. We get sucked into the things of this world. The advertisements come on TV and it catches our attention and it catches our eye. It's like, oh, wouldn't that be wonderful? But He's all we need. And He satisfies. And it gets better every day when we walk with Him. Don't be like the children of Israel. Don't complain when things are not going as you would like for them to go, but learn how to be thankful for what you have. And learn how to just focus on God's goodness in your life. And you'll see that God will take care of you all the days of your life. David said this, and I'll close. He says, I've been young and now I'm old, but I've never seen the righteous forsaken nor their seed begging for bread. God will supply if you'll learn to be content with Him. Would you stand with me all over the house?